The subway station was alive with its usual rhythm. The metallic screech of trains pulling in and out, the chatter of hurried commuters, and the hum of street musicians playing on a corner. Among the crowd, an elderly woman named Martha stood out. She was dressed in a faded gray coat and clutched a worn handbag to her chest. Her frail hands trembled slightly as she fed coins into a ticket machine. Life hadn't been easy for Martha. Widowed for nearly 2 decades, she lived on a small pension that barely covered her modest needs. Every subway ride was an exercise in frugality, carefully counting coins to avoid dipping into the little savings she had managed to scrape together. Watching her from the shadows was Jake, a wiry man in his late 20s with a hoodie pulled low over his face. His eyes were sharp, scanning the station with practiced precision. Jake wasn't new to this. He had been picking pockets for years, a grim skill he'd turned to after losing his job and spiraling into debt. But today, he wasn't just looking for an easy mark. He was looking for survival. His stomach churned with hunger, and desperation gnawed at him like a beast. Jake's eyes locked onto Martha. She seemed like the perfect target, vulnerable, distracted, and unlikely to fight back. As she finally retrieved her ticket and shuffled toward the platform, Jake followed, maintaining a careful distance. He told himself it wasn't personal. It never was. But Jake wasn't the only one observing Martha. Seated on a bench, trying to stay inconspicuous, was none other than Keanu Reeves. Dressed in simple jeans, a jacket, and a baseball cap pulled low, Keanu blended into the crowd. He enjoyed the rare freedom of anonymity in public spaces, where he could simply exist without being mobbed by fans. Keanu wasn't there for a movie shoot or a public appearance. He had spent the day visiting a friend in the city and had decided to take the subway to experience the pulse of everyday life. He was flipping through a paperback novel when his attention was drawn to Martha. Something about her fragile demeanor tugged at his heart. Then he noticed Jake, his movements predatory, his focus locked on the unsuspecting woman. Martha reached the platform just as the train pulled in. The crowd surged forward and Jake moved quickly, his hand darting out to snatch her handbag. The theft was swift and silent, and for a moment, Jake thought he had succeeded. But Martha's sharp cry shattered the air. "Stop! My bag!" Chaos erupted. Passengers turned to look, but no one moved to intervene. Jake bolted toward the station exit, clutching the handbag tightly. Martha stood frozen, tears streaming down her face, her voice breaking as she called for help. Keanu didn't hesitate. He stood up, his long strides quickly eating the distance between him and Jake. His athletic build and years of action movie training had honed his reflexes. But this wasn't a film. This was real, and someone needed him. Jake darted down a dimly lit corridor near the station's exit, thinking he had escaped. But Keanu was relentless. "Hey!" he called out, his voice calm but commanding. Jake slowed and turned, his breath ragged. His eyes widened in disbelief as he recognized Keanu Reeves standing before him. For a moment, neither man moved. The corridor was eerily quiet, save for their breathing and the distant rumble of trains. Jake's grip on the handbag tightened, but his resolve faltered. This wasn't how he'd imagined the day would go. Keanu took a step closer, his hands raised in a gesture of peace. "Let's talk," he said, his voice low and steady. "You don't have to do this." Jake's face twisted with a mix of defiance and shame. "You don't know what it's like," he muttered, his voice barely audible. Keanu nodded, his expression softening. "Maybe not. But I know it doesn't have to end like this." The dim corridor felt like a world apart from the bustling subway station just a few steps away. Jake stared at Keanu, his pulse pounding in his ears. This wasn't some ordinary bystander coming after him. This was Keanu Reeves, an international movie star, a legend. Jake's mind raced, torn between running and staying to face whatever came next. Keanu's gaze was steady, but kind. He could see the internal battle playing out in Jake's tense stance and shifting eyes. He had seen desperation before, in friends, strangers, and even himself during difficult times. This wasn't about catching a thief. It was about understanding a person who had clearly reached a breaking point. "You're not a bad guy," Keanu said softly, taking a cautious step forward. Jake flinched, gripping the stolen handbag tighter. "If you were, you wouldn't look so scared right now." Jake barked a bitter laugh. "Scared? What do you know about being scared? You're rich. You've got everything. His voice cracked as the words tumbled out. I've got nothing. No job. No home. No one who cares if I live or die. The raw emotion in Jake's voice hung in the air. Keanu took a deep breath, choosing his words carefully. I don't know your full story, Jake. Jake's head snapped up. How do you know my name? Keanu allowed himself a small smile. Your driver's license fell out of your pocket when you ran. I picked it up on the way. He reached into his jacket and held up the battered piece of plastic. I didn't mean to pry, but it seems like you've been carrying a heavy load for a long time. Jake's face flushed with embarrassment and anger. You don't get it. You don't know what it's like to go hungry, to sleep on the street, to feel invisible. His voice wavered. People like you don't live in my world. Keanu's expression softened. You'd be surprised, he said quietly. I've known loss. I've known pain. I've had moments where I questioned everything, but I've also learned that it's okay to ask for help. It doesn't make you weak. It makes you human. Jake's grip on the handbag loosened slightly. He glanced down at it as if seeing it for the first time. The weight of what he'd done began to sink in. I didn't want to hurt her, he mumbled. I didn't know what else to do. Keanu stepped closer, his voice gentle but firm. Then let's make it right. Give her back her bag. She's probably more scared than you are right now. Jake hesitated, the words resonating with something deep inside him. Slowly he extended the handbag toward Keanu, who took it without breaking eye contact. The tension in the air eased, replaced by an unexpected stillness. You did the right thing, Keanu said, his voice full of sincerity. That takes courage. Jake slumped against the wall, his energy spent. He looked down at his scuffed shoes, unable to meet Keanu's gaze. What now? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Keanu glanced at the handbag, then back at Jake. Now, we go back. You return this to the woman, and we take it from there. Jake's head shot up, panic flashing in his eyes. Go back? Are you crazy? They'll call the cops. I'll go to jail. Keanu placed a reassuring hand on Jake's shoulder. Not if you're honest. People are more forgiving than you think. And if it comes to that, I'll be there with you. Jake stared at him, searching for any hint of deception, but found none. For the first time in years, he felt a glimmer of hope. A small, fragile thing, but real nonetheless. Together, they walked back to the platform. The scene they returned to was tense. Martha was seated on a bench, tears streaming down her cheeks as concerned onlookers tried to comfort her. When she saw Jake approaching with Keanu, her eyes widened in fear. Jake stopped a few steps away, his hands trembling. Keanu gave him a nod of encouragement. Go on, he said softly. I'm sorry, Jake stammered, holding out the handbag. I didn't mean to scare you. I was desperate, but that's no excuse. Please take it back. Martha hesitated, her eyes darting between Jake and Keanu. Slowly, she reached out and took the bag. Her hands were shaking as much as his. Why? She asked, her voice thick with emotion. Why did you do this? Jake swallowed hard, shame flooding his face. I didn't know what else to do. I'm so sorry. Before anyone else could speak, Keanu stepped forward. He's trying to make things right, he said gently, and sometimes that's the hardest thing to do. The crowd, which had been murmuring in disapproval, began to quiet. The atmosphere shifted, the anger and fear giving way to curiosity, and for some, compassion. As the tension eased, Keanu placed a supportive hand on Jake's shoulder. This isn't the end of your story, he said. It's just the beginning of a better one. As the weight of Jake's confession hung in the air, the subway crowd remained silent, unsure of what to make of the situation. Keanu's presence had a calming effect, but all eyes were still on Jake, waiting to see what would happen next. The fear that had gripped Jake only moments before seemed to dissipate slightly, replaced by a growing resolve. He had faced his moment of truth, but he knew this was just the beginning of his journey toward redemption. Martha, the elderly woman Jake had tried to rob, looked at him with a mixture of confusion and sympathy. Her hands, still trembling, clutched the handbag she had just been given back. She could see the pain in Jake's eyes, the desperation that had driven him to such an act. She wasn't angry anymore, just sad. Jake shifted uncomfortably under her gaze, unsure of what to say. But before he could utter another apology, Martha did something that took everyone by surprise. She reached into her handbag, pulled out a few crumpled bills and held them out to Jake. "Here," she said softly. "I don't know what you're going through, but maybe this will help." Jake stared at the money in disbelief. He didn't deserve her kindness, not after what he had done. I, I can't take that," he stammered, backing away. "I don't deserve it." Martha smiled faintly, her eyes full of warmth. "It's not about what you deserve, son. It's about giving someone a second chance." The crowd, which had been watching with bated breath, began to murmur again, this time with a different tone. The anger and fear from before had faded, replaced by a sense of awe at Martha's unexpected generosity. Even Keanu seemed moved by the gesture, though he knew there was still more to be done. He turned to Jake, who was still frozen in place, unable to process the kindness being shown to him. "Jake," Keanu said gently, "this is your moment. Take it. You don't have to walk this road alone anymore." Jake hesitated, his mind racing. Everything in his life had been a struggle up until this point. Every choice, every decision had led him further down a dark path. But here, in this unlikely moment, he was being offered something he had long forgotten how to accept: forgiveness. With a shaky hand, Jake reached out and took the money from Martha. Tears welled up in his eyes, and for the first time in years, he allowed himself to cry. It wasn't just about the money. It was about the fact that someone, a complete stranger, believed in him enough to give him a second chance. "Thank you," Jake whispered, his voice barely audible. "I don't know how to repay you." Martha shook her head. "You don't need to repay me, dear. Just take care of yourself, and maybe one day you can do the same for someone else." As the crowd began to disperse, Keanu stepped forward, his arm still resting on Jake's shoulder. "You're going to be okay," he said quietly, "but there's one more thing we need to do." Jake looked up at him, puzzled. "What do you mean?" Keanu smiled. "Let's get you some help. There are places that can give you a fresh start, people who can help you get back on your feet." Jake's heart raced. The idea of receiving help, of actually getting off the streets and starting over, felt too good to be true. "I don't know," he said hesitantly. "I've been on my own for so long. I don't even know where to begin." "You don't have to know," Keanu replied. "That's what I'm here for. Let me help you find your way." The next few hours passed in a blur. Keanu, true to his word, stayed by Jake's side as they made their way to a local shelter that specialized in helping people like Jake. People who had lost everything but were ready to fight for a second chance. The staff at the shelter greeted Jake with open arms, offering him a warm meal, a safe place to sleep, and, most importantly, hope for the future. Jake was overwhelmed. For the first time in years, he didn't feel invisible. He didn't feel like a lost cause. He felt seen, heard, and, most surprisingly, cared for. As he sat down to eat, he glanced over at Keanu, who was chatting with one of the shelter's volunteers. It was surreal. This A-list celebrity, someone Jake had only ever seen in movies, had taken time out of his life to help a stranger. Later that evening, Keanu sat down next to Jake, his expression thoughtful. "This is just the beginning, you know," he said quietly. "It's not going to be easy, but you've already taken the hardest step. You asked for help." Jake nodded, his throat tight with emotion. "I don't know how to thank you." Keanu smiled. "You don't have to. Just pay it forward when you can." As the night wore on, Jake felt a strange sense of peace settle over him. For the first time in as long as he could remember, he felt like he had a future, like there was something worth fighting for. He didn't know what the next day would bring, but he knew one thing for sure: he wasn't alone anymore. Months passed, and Jake's life began to take a new shape. With the support of the shelter and the connections Keanu had arranged, he enrolled in a job training program, learning skills that gave him the confidence to re-enter society. It wasn't easy. Every step forward came with moments of doubt and fear. But each time Jake felt like giving up, he remembered the kindness that had been shown to him on that subway platform. One evening, as Jake helped serve dinner to new arrivals at the shelter, a way of giving back to the place that had given him so much, he noticed a familiar face walk through the door. It was Martha, the elderly woman he had tried to rob. She carried a casserole dish and a warm smile, greeting the staff like old friends. Jake froze, unsure of what to do. Would she recognize him? Would she be angry that he was here? But before he could decide whether to slip away unnoticed, Martha's eyes met his. She smiled warmly. "Jake, isn't it?" Jake nodded, his heart pounding. "Yes, ma'am, I didn't think you'd remember me." "How could I forget?" she said, setting the dish down. "I've been keeping you in my prayers since that day. It looks like they worked." Jake felt a lump rise in his throat. "I owe you everything," he said, his voice shaking. "If it weren't for you and Mr. Reeves, I don't know where I'd be right now." Martha reached out and patted his hand. "It wasn't just us, dear. You did the hard work. You chose to change your life. That's something to be proud of." Later that night, Jake sat down to write a letter to Keanu. Though they hadn't seen each other in months, Keanu had left Jake with his contact information, encouraging him to stay in touch. Jake poured his heart into the letter, thanking Keanu for his kindness and updating him on his progress. He ended with a promise. "When I'm back on my feet completely, I'll find a way to help others, just like you helped me. You've shown me that it's never too late to start over. Thank you for believing in me when I didn't believe in myself." Weeks later, Jake received a handwritten letter in return. It was short but heartfelt, written in Keanu's unmistakable scrawl. "Jake, I'm so proud of you. Remember, the road ahead might not always be smooth, but you've already proven you have the strength to walk it. Keep going and never forget that every act of kindness, big or small, has the power to change lives. Stay strong, Keanu." The letter became one of Jake's most treasured possessions, a reminder of how far he had come. Years later, Jake was unrecognizable from the man he had been. Clean-shaven and dressed in a suit, he stood at the podium of a community center, addressing a room full of struggling individuals who had come to hear his story. "I was once where you are now," Jake began, his voice steady but emotional. "I made mistakes, and I lost my way. But someone believed in me when I didn't believe in myself. They gave me a second chance, and it changed my life. I'm here to tell you that the same can happen for you." In the audience, Martha sat in the front row, her eyes glistening with pride. Keanu, who had slipped into the back unnoticed, watched with a quiet smile. He didn't need recognition for his part in Jake's journey. Seeing the transformation was reward enough. As Jake stepped down from the podium, the room erupted in applause. He had come full circle, turning his pain into purpose and his story into hope for others. And in the quiet corner of the room, Keanu knew that this was the true power of kindness, the ability to ignite change that rippled far beyond what anyone could imagine.